You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. In mid-November, San Francisco played host to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit. Taking place on the sidelines was a historic meeting between the leaders of the two most significant Pacific and world economies, China and the U.S., with the November 15th bilateral between President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Because of the pandemic, there have been few face-to-face conversations between the pair. Exchanges like these are the glue that keep both countries on solid footing, even when the leaders may not be. While both presidents have taken steps to reduce tensions over the summer, the reality is no one knows exactly what the next era of U.S.-China relations will look like. Ivan Kanapathy was on the White House National Security Council from 2018 to 2021 and helped steer U.S.-China policy for President Biden as well as former President Trump. And he joins me now. Ivan Kanapathy, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, thanks for having me, Ray.
What are the big pending issues between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping in late 2023?
I think the question is, what aren't the big pending issues? They range everywhere from security, military security issues to economic security issues, which then blend right on into trade. And then, of course, there are issues on the more political side to do with human rights, transnational repression. The range of issues that span the U.S.-China relationship are almost all-encompassing.
It's been interesting to watch things get more tense on the international security side of the ledger, even as the U.S.-China economic relationship remains robust. Can those two things continue to live side by side in this tense atmosphere?
So those two things have existed really for decades in the U.S.-China relationship. They've always been a tension. I think that the economic interdependence has traditionally dominated, and I think we've seen over the last 5 years is sort of the rise of these other issues taking more of a forefront. But again, the economic issues are still quite important.
But can one end up really working to the detriment of the other? Can the security environment become so tense that the economic relationship suffers, or vice versa?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've always sort of had that degree. I mean, it was 1989, Tiananmen Square, when the first sort of quote-unquote arms embargoes happened. The United States applied them in the wake of that. The European Union did. Also, those have continued, but those apply to completed products that we would call weapons of war. And so that's part of the economic relationship. And with small, what we've seen is those security concerns where they have to do with military development further down the supply chain of weapons. Now they're starting to creep in. And a lot of things nowadays are what we would consider to be dual use. And so that's where the questions really come. Is this purely for commercial gain, if you will, and for the commercial relationship, or is there some leakage happening here into military development or potentially even human rights abuse?
You know, over a long time, as this relationship has evolved, some commentators have delighted in portraying American presidents, certainly Joe Biden, as supplicants, imagining China as the party holding all the good cards. But doesn't Xi Jinping have his own recent problems economically that mean that, he doesn't have all the chips on his side of the table?
No, that's right, Ray. Xi Jinping has some real things to contend with. And I think most recently what we've seen over the course of this year is really some problems with his own domestic economy. And China's domestic economy is so big as a function of the global economy that this is something we all need to care about. But China's sort of growth rates of past years is an era that's sort of ending now. And we need to really get used to a China with much lower consistent growth rates. And how China manages that is, again, it's of importance to everybody because it has impacts to everybody.
There's a lot of, what do they call it, China plus one economic thinking going on right now. I wonder whether it's penetrated the merely threatening or merely interesting and become something a little bit more serious now. This idea that to hedge your bets, in addition to having productive capacity in China, you'd also have it in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Korea, in Taiwan itself.
Yeah, that's right. I think that one of the big lessons from a couple events, right, that we've all recently lived through, one, the pandemic, and then two, Ukraine with particular applicability to Russia. I think that has caused a lot of business interests, multinational firms, to look at, oh my gosh, what if something happens again, like the pandemic, and we're sort of solely dependent from one location for a certain part of our supply chains? And again, something could happen geopolitically in this time with China, which would be significantly worse than what happened with Russia in 2022. And so people are really thinking about that diversification and whether you want to call it de-risking or decoupling. I think at least having a backup to supply chains that rely on any one country, but obviously the principal one of concern is China, because so many of our supply chains do run through there.
But has that had the possible effect of cooling things off in China, as someone who needs a supplier might go to Vietnam now instead?
Yeah, it's absolutely had that effect. And Ray, so this was happening, to be clear, before the pandemic, before President Trump came into office. This trend was already happening because, frankly, the cost of labor in China had risen relative to a place like Vietnam or some other countries, South Asia, for example. And so that you're already starting to see this. And what happened with geopolitics is that accelerated it. What happened with the pandemic experience, et cetera, et cetera. Those are really just accelerating trends that folks had already predicted were going to happen.
Let's move to the security side of the conversation. Taiwan has managed to live a long time in a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy limbo. China-Taiwan bilateral trade exploded. The U.S. very quietly kept China guessing on how hard it would resist any hostile mainland takeover. And while China continued to insist Taiwan was simply part of China, it made no moves to force the issue. Why did that approach run its course? Why is it no longer suited for purpose in 2023?
So that approach is suited for purpose in 2023. The question is, how much longer is it going to hold? And I think folks, including myself, are predicting that it can't hold much longer for a couple of reasons. One is that China has never really had another option, meaning they didn't have, and I would argue even today, don't really reliably have the ability to take over Taiwan militarily, at least not that they believe they're confident in themselves. And so really that wasn't a choice. And so they had to sort of play the long game for all this time. And then the other factor that's butting up against that, or running in parallel rather, is that Taiwanese society is really drifting by each generation. And you can see it year to year if you look at various types of polls, more and more away from China. And what happened in 2019, 2020 in Hong Kong was an accelerant of that longer term evolution also that we've seen, where folks in Taiwan woke up, observed what was happening in Hong Kong and said, you know what, I'm not sure I want to be part of that. I'm not sure I want a political union with that entity over there on the mainland. And you see that more and more in Taiwan. And that's obviously a big threat politically to the regime in Beijing.
Taiwanese drift, but of all the three parties in the triangular relationship, is it Xi Jinping who's changed the status quo more than anyone else?
I think that Xi Jinping is changing the status quo through some of the aggressive moves that he's made. I think in Xi Jinping's mind, he's reacting to some of the trends on Taiwan that I mentioned. But at the same time, I think each of the three parties in that triangular relationship sort of went into this deal, if you will, decades ago with their own individual definitions. And those definitions are no longer able to overlap as much as they used to.
President Biden's been unusually blunt when it came to insisting on America's continued role as a security shield for Taiwan. Were you still in government when he made that statement? What can you tell us about it?
I think I was in government the first time. He's argued that he would militarily defend Taiwan, depending on the exact words, up to 4 times now. I think that President Biden, frankly, watched what happened in 2022 with Vladimir Putin in February, which before February 24th, 2022, President Biden made it clear that he would not send American troops to defend Ukraine. And maybe there was some regret possibly, and I think he really wanted to make sure there was a strong signal of deterrence, of resolve sent that Xi Jinping did not interpret some of these other sort of happenings in the world to also apply over there in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, you talk about Joe Biden trying to make sure. Isn't Xi Jinping likely to look and make the same calculus? If he's watching Ukraine for clues about how the world might respond to Taiwan, isn't this kind of a negative lesson?
For Xi Jinping, I think there are a couple of lessons, right? I think he's seen the world respond to Ukraine with a large number of economic impacts, but I think there are folks that can argue that, well, Putin's still in power. Putin's economy hasn't completely cratered, right? He's still going. The price of oil is still supporting his war efforts. And then the other lesson that I think Xi Jinping takes goes right back to the beginning of that invasion, which is, well, if someone's going to attempt this type of aggression, they need to go all in at the beginning because Putin's failure was not making it to the capital, not making it to Kyiv. And maybe that does give Xi Jinping some pause, depending on, again, sort of how he assesses his own military capabilities.
The embrace of Vladimir Putin by Xi Jinping, even as Russia was invading and savaging Ukraine, and Ukraine, incidentally, also a big Chinese trading partner. Recently, the North Koreans became Russian ammunitions and arms suppliers. It's hard to know if Kim Jong-un would have made that deal without a green light from China. Xi has not made China a big Russian supplier, but it is a major Russian customer for energy and a banker. What do Chinese and American leaders have to talk about when it comes to Russia and Ukraine?
Oh, I think they have a lot to talk about, Ray. You're right. China has held back on sending actual weapons, actual munitions to Russia, but they've really walked right up to that line. There are a lot of, as we mentioned before, dual use types of items. So items that end up going into aircraft. In fact, there's been reports of actual parts that are designed and manufactured to go into fighter aircraft, to go into other kinds of weapons that are being shipped or have been shipped from China to Russia. And those are clearly of concern. Obviously, China has become a big consumer of Russian commodities, oil, et cetera, and that continues to support the Russia's economy and Putin's war effort in that sense. So the United States and China are definitely on opposite sides of this issue, as they are on opposite sides, I think, right now in the Middle East on the Israel issue, too.
Well, besides being just a complicating factor, with them rooting for different teams, does it actually affect the U.S.-China bilateral, what's going on in the Middle East right now?
I think it does. So I think China sees, frankly, with both these conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, a lot of opportunity. And the opportunity is to build China's image in the world. You see that a little bit with Ukraine, with certain countries that are trying to remain non-aligned, India amongst them. And that might have given China a little more sway in what we call the global south, a lot of the developing countries. And you really see it with the Israel fight and sort of how that war is going, where China wants to be the leader of the global south, if you will, which is really much more aligned to the Palestinian cause in this case than they are to the Israeli cause.
It was said for a long time that China's paramount interest as an international trading power was not in who wins or loses, but stability, order in the world system. As China feels its oats, as it feels that it is a more powerful presence on the world stage, can it sustain a little bit more instability, or is that still the Chinese preference, let's say?
So I believe that was the Chinese preference for a couple of decades, and it no longer is. I think that that was the Chinese preference because it considered itself sort of a smaller power and needed to build up its overall national power. And that's when development was the primary goal of the Chinese Communist Party. It was also the basis of legitimacy for the regime, was to provide that development to its own people. What you're seeing now is a shift in the narratives in China, much more towards nationalism, much more towards struggle, so therefore sort of sacrifice. And that points to a place where they are, one, willing to sacrifice this order or stability in the world, but really where they're anticipating greater instability, right, and greater tensions in their relations and their place in the world. And Xi Jinping's preparing his people, his economy, the overall ideology and philosophy for that transition. And that's sort of where we find ourselves moving into.
It hasn't become quite as institutionalized as Kremlin watching did when I was a kid during the height of the Cold War. But speculating about what's really going on in Beijing is now a lively sport. Whether Xi stays Putin's hand or gives him free rein, whether economic setbacks cool Beijing's international ambitions or stoke them, whether demographic realities mean there's a window of opportunity in which China will almost certainly invade Taiwan or never will. I've read learned, thoughtful, smart arguments that are 180 degrees apart on these topics. I guess, for one thing, it means you're always going to have a job, but can we really, from the United States, understand what's going on inside the top echelons of Chinese government?
So I think the best thing we can do, Ray, and I agree with you, there are a lot of really smart people that know more and have experienced more than I have, that have opinions that both align and are different than mine. But I think the best method that we can use is to really judge Xi Jinping and China, that leadership, by its actions rather than its rhetoric. And so as long as we steer away from sort of what they're saying, focus on what they're doing, and also focus on, I guess, in some ways, reality rather than what I would consider sort of a rose-tinted optimism that sometimes I would say arrives from mirror imaging, right? Our ability to kind of, whether you call it a flaw or a good thing, to try to see the best in people, sometimes I think clouds our judgment.
Ivan Kanapathy is the senior associate in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spade. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yund is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.